Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to talk about the book The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. So this book I've talked about When the Body Says No and The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate, and he does talk about this book in his books. I was not recommended this by my therapist, but I have heard, I kept hearing it come up. And so when I saw it, in Gabor Mate's book, he cited it because he was using an example from the book. I was like, oh, I might want to read that because it also talks about the whole mind, body, and trauma and how that can make you sick, I guess. And I don't know, I feel like I had heard this title a few times somewhere, like on social media. And so I was like, oh, I should really read that book. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, this book is very graphic. Like, you don't even need to watch the rest of my video. If you can't deal with graphic descriptions of abuse, specific types of abuse, I'm really sensitive to that kind of stuff. I do not like hearing about, I really don't like hearing about that kind of stuff at all, but especially specific types of abuse. I don't know if my video is going to get like restricted. I'm not monetized, but this is a difficult book to get through. At least I found it difficult. I still have like an hour or two to get through of the book because it was not what I was expecting. And if you're very sensitive to stuff like that, just avoid this book. This whole video is probably just going to be a content warning. Very graphic descriptions of abuse, all kinds of abuse, particularly one specific type of abuse that nobody wants to hear about. It is really awful. It's a really horrible book to get through. I don't recommend it. I'm just going to tell you straight right now, I don't recommend it. And if you're chronically ill, this book actually doesn't touch on chronic illness as much as Gabor Mate's book of When the Body Says No. This one does talk more about the psychological implications of, trauma and sort of how that manifests. They seem to talk more about how it manifests psychologically and behaviorally. I'm trying to think, does he talk about illness? I do think he talks about illness and chronic conditions and stuff like that, but it's mostly like, PTSD, all of these diagnoses that people have, ADD, that kind of thing, and how, trauma and abuse can lead to you having those diagnoses later on in life, and also just having uncontrollable behavior. He even talks about like multiple personality disorder, things like that. He's very good at telling stories. His anecdotes and stuff are very descriptive, very explicit, and you definitely make that connection between this person's trauma and how it manifested in their psychological issues later on in life. Lots of talk about medicine and psychology, the DSM, different psychological labels. This guy seems to not really like those labels because he feels that, they're not helpful, which, they probably aren't. It's just really, I feel like this book is almost more for practitioners to read so that they, especially if they're dealing with trauma victims, because it'll help them understand the science behind it and how it doesn't matter what you label the person, what they need is certain types of therapies to deal with the trauma and to process the trauma. This book really, I feel like this book is not for anybody that is chronically ill or even anybody that has a psychological condition. It's very extremely triggering. I'm just going to say that right now. It's funny because I just have it over and over again in my notes. It's horrifying. It's triggering. Like, if I wasn't traumatized before I read this book, I definitely am now. It is just horrific. I hope I forget everything that I've read in this book. Um, he focuses a lot on study. So he does talk about a lot of sort of these studies that changed, and he talks about very old studies, right? Studies from back in the day, way back in the day, that changed the course of medicine and psychology and the way we view, you know, mental health conditions and things like that. Like, I think he said that, back in the day, people didn't believe that hitting your kids was a problem, or that even like, um, incest, there was nothing wrong with that. Like, there was no literature saying that that stuff was bad and that it could hurt, a child or anybody. And he talks about sort of these landmark studies that happened that changed the course of how we view those types of things. And so he does talk, he talks pretty thoroughly about different studies that have occurred throughout time, that have changed the course of how we look at those things, and why we now label them as traumatic or abuse, or that kind of thing. So he does a pretty good job at giving you a history of why we believe the things that we believe now. Like hitting your kids is bad. It could lead to behavioral issues. So it's interesting if you like to know the history of stuff like that and how we came to know that. But the fact that, I was born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s, and a lot of that stuff was already kind of coming into the mainstream. I remember reading parenting magazines that would talk about, like, how parents shouldn't bring their work problems home, and that those stressors home, because it could affect their kids. So all of that stuff was already, you know, going mainstream as I was growing up. And obviously now it's even more popular. We know a lot more about trauma. Trauma has become even a sort of like buzzword. Everybody has trauma, and, oh, this is trauma, and my trauma, and, my trauma is being triggered. So it's become almost like this pop culture type of thing. So I actually did not read the book. I got the audiobook. I don't know what's worse, hearing it read out loud or actually reading it. It's just, hearing this stuff is just, I can't imagine the guy that actually did the reading, the narrating of the book. He was probably just like, what am I reading? There is a lot of explaining, a lot of describing, a lot of name dropping, a lot of talking about the early research. And this guy, this Bessel Kolk guy, he also likes to talk, he likes to kind of toot his own horn a bit and talk about his research and his findings. And, he was involved in this study, and he used to work at this university or at this clinic. He does seem to be very at the forefront of everything. And, I'm just like, whatever, he's very proud of himself. But it just gave that kind of vibe, like this very kind of snooty type of vibe. So, the missing part for me here, the missing part that I got, you can go back and look at my review for When the Body Says No. That one does address physical illness, like conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, or, autoimmune illnesses, cancer, things like that. And it does make that sort of mind-body connection. It's very interesting. Was I thrilled with that book? No. This book does not make the connections as much with physical illnesses like autoimmune conditions, things like that, as it does with mental illness. And we do know now, we know that there's a direct connection between trauma and your psychological state. It's almost like stating the obvious. That's what it feels like to me. Maybe at the time that the book was written, this is a post 9/11 book, because he does talk about how, the trauma and stuff after 9/11. So this is a post 9/11 book. I don't remember what year it is, but it's after 2001. So at that point, we did already know a lot about trauma, from the Vietnam veterans and stuff like that. He does talk a lot about that as well. and that trauma can, cause behavior issues and cause other issues like sleep problems and stuff like that. He does get into that a bit on how it can affect your physical, your sleeping patterns, and how then that can affect your health and cause other problems. But most of the focus is on psychological issues, behavior problems in adults, behavior problems in children, just really, really horrific stuff. If you can tolerate that kind of stuff, then this is the book for you. If you really like reading about that kind of stuff, then go for it. For me, it was lacking the connection, and the other book too, the books by Gabor Mate, were also lacking this connection, or this I mean, it's a very specific, I guess, very specific to my situation and to many of us, many of you guys that watch my videos. But when it comes to an acquired illness, for example, something like Lyme disease, something like long COVID, even MS, because we're seeing that there's science showing that a virus could be behind MS and also ME/CFS. Does all of this stuff apply to us as well? Would traumatic childhoods or, child abuse or whatever, would that make us more vulnerable to developing, say, long COVID, something like that? That's something that I would be very interested in learning about. And I feel like none of this stuff addresses that. And maybe in the future, we're going to start seeing more books addressing that as we see the masses of people with long COVID, Lyme disease, ME/CFS. Maybe there will be some research studies asking, well, what was your childhood like? There may be difficulty in finding out whether that does affect these types of conditions, because a lot of us are very resistant to people making those types of connections, because we know that we got our illness from somewhere, from something. But I am curious, because I did see, not specifically in this book, I mean, there are some concepts in this book that probably would apply to me, but also in the other books that, certain childhood traumas or the way that you're raised or the way that your parents treat you can be the result. The end result in adulthood could be an illness. Right now, both my brother and my sister are dealing with chronic ongoing issues. And now that they have that, I am starting to wonder, because it's three of us, right? All three of us. I am starting to wonder whether there is some kind of family dynamic type of component that could have made us more vulnerable to illness. And that's, Gabor Mate does a pretty good job of making those connections, that certain things can make you more vulnerable or can trigger illness, your personality type, which you develop in childhood. But, I do think that those of us that have gotten sick off of something, COVID, Lyme disease, whatever, that it would be interesting to see whether there is a connection there. And again, this book actually, I want to say that this book does actually go through different modalities. They talk about biofeedback, they talk about EMDR, and he does go in depth with these therapies. He does show kind of like examples of these therapies and how they help people. So he does present these modalities that are helpful with trauma, particularly severe trauma. But again, I'm wondering if some of these modalities would be helpful in healing physical symptoms or physical ailments, or at least helping to alleviate some of that. I have heard of biofeedback, and I have seen people talk about how biofeedback helped them with their, Lyme disease or whatever other symptoms they had. And I think I had a doctor or a physical therapist talk to me about biofeedback. I just didn't know what it was. So he does go in depth with each modality, and he shows examples of how it's used. He does talk about CBT and how it's very limited in helping with trauma. He does talk about how talking may not necessarily be the best way to deal with trauma or to process trauma. Again, this book is not like a self-help type of book. It is not a book that is going to have stuff in there that you can use right away or that you can do right away. And he even talks about how biofeedback is very, very expensive. It can be very, very effective, but it's very expensive and insurance doesn't cover it. And it's not like accepted by the medical mainstream. I mean, like I said, this book is from a while back, so I don't know if things have changed now. And of course, EMDR is kind of one of those newer types of therapies that is still kind of considered woo-woo. So there's, and all of these things you need a professional to help you with. It's not something that you can do on your own. And so far I haven't seen anything like that in his book of things that you can do on your own. Now, when I talk about things that you can do on your own, and you're going to see this in my other videos where I review the other books, that I talk about this. So what do I mean by that? If you want to find a book or a couple books that are good at kind of giving you something to work on, I do have them here. You're going to find them in the playlist, my book reviews playlist, and they are by Tony Bernard. It's, I think, How to Be Sick and How to Live Well with Chronic Pain and Illness. Those books, I always say those books were game changers for me. And she's not a psychologist. She's not a psychologist. I think she does have a PhD, but she was like, I think, a law professor or something. She was a professor at a university. She has no psychology background, but she was she was practicing Buddhism when she became sick. She has ME/CFS. And she will show you how to incorporate those Buddhist practices. She took those Buddhist practices and incorporated them, kind of changed them in order to help her with dealing with her chronic condition. And she does a really good job of that. And she describes the exercise. She says, this is how you're going to do it. This is, do this. I mean, she gives you a step-by-step. And this is someone who's not even a psychologist. And so it's a bit disappointing. And I think sometimes only a sick person or somebody that's inside a sick body can tell you how to cope with that, or even how to heal that. I mean, I don't know if many of us have actually healed our own illnesses without any other kind of intervention, but she does a pretty good job of that, given that she has no background in psychology. And it's disappointing that these books don't present something simple. He does talk about yoga. You can do yoga. Obviously, many of us can't because we can't move that well. Breathing exercises, whatever. But there's nothing really so far that I've seen that is like, here are steps that you can take. Here are things that you can bring up to your therapist, or ideas that you could present, or modalities that you can use, exercises that you can do. He does talk about, like, I think it's something called like family systems therapy or something like that. But it's like in a group setting, and you do need a therapist, I think, there, or a group setting. So again, these aren't things that you can do yourself. So, this book, I would just stay away from this book. Like I said, especially if you're very sensitive to stuff. It's not gonna, this one does not have as much of a chronic illness or physical illness focus as I thought it was going to be, because it does give you like this sort of mind-body vibe, right? When the body keeps the score. But it talks just, about psychological conditions, which we all know are a direct result of childhood trauma, abuse, even an accident. 9/11 was a big one. So it's not a new concept. He's just kind of showing the effective treatments and how certain treatments are not as effective, and what treatments have been shown to be effective for even very, very severe trauma. And the focus of this book is very severe trauma, very serious, very severe trauma. It doesn't seem, because I was like, it would be nice if he kind of, if there was a version of this book that dealt with, because a lot of people and a lot of kids have trauma, a lot of times when we think of like child abuse, we think of like the most severe cases, but child abuse really isn't, I think, what people conceptualize in their mind, like beating up a child until they're bleeding. That's not the most common. And I think child abuse is very, very common, but it's not like that. And that's kind of what he's presenting in this book, is like the very, very severe traumas and the therapies that can help that. So I just really didn't find this book helpful. I still have an hour. I'm going to get through it, but I was like, I really do regret reading this thing because it is really awful. It is really, really tough to get through. Very explicit and graphic. Um, it's very fascinating, the types of therapies that he talks about at the end. So that might be probably the most useful part. I do think some of those therapies could be helpful for people with chronic physical conditions. But he doesn't talk about how it could be beneficial for that. He does talk about how it could be beneficial for mental health conditions, people that self-injure, that have maybe eating disorders, things like that. But as far as a chronic illness, an autoimmune illness, he doesn't really touch on that very much. So I don't know if this was even helpful for you guys. I just hope that it's that if somebody stumbles upon this before they've read the book, just be very careful. Tread carefully with this book. It is really, really tough to get through, and I can't stress that enough. So anyways, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.